Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to Network Tech Zone. My name is Sanjana. In our previous video, we have configured static NAT using Auto and Manual NAT. I have given the link of those videos in the description box below. Today, we are going to configure static NAT using Auto and Manual NAT. Static NAT is also called as a port translation. So when we compare to static NAT, the static NAT mapping is also called as one-to-one translation. And in static NAT, we can create one-to-one mapping of IP address, which is bidirectional. And in case of static NAT, port of one IP address will be translated to another IP address, and it is always unidirectional. And in case of static NAT, we are using just the layer 3 header of OSI reference model. But in case of static NAT, we will be using both the layer 3 and layer 4 header of the OSI reference model. In static NAT, it also allows the specific UDP or the TCP port on the global address to be translated to specific port. So with this brief introduction, let's get started with the configuration. I have got the Cisco ASA firewall placed in between the inside and the outside network. For the inside network, I have 10.1.1.0 with the /24, out of which 1.1 is already configured on the router 3, and 1.3 is configured for the R1. So, and for the outside, I have got 192.168.29.0, and we got 29.2. And we have 29.2 for the outside interface for the ASA firewall. And we got 29.3 for the router outside. And this ISP that you see here is my default home router at my house. And it has got the default gateway, which is 192.168.29.1. So the goal here is, let's assume that this is a user. This is only for the lab purpose. I have just taken a router, but let's just imagine that this device is where the user is sitting at home and he's trying to access, he's trying to get in to the router 3 and router 1. And he's trying to get in with this private network with the help of a ISP using Telnet. I have used Telnet just for the lab purpose for understanding. Okay, so if you are using static NAT, we already know that static NAT is always using one-to-one mapping, right? So, but if you have just one single public IP address, but you still have a lot of networks connected, you still have a lot of hosts connected, and you're trying to access, that is not possible if you're having a larger infrastructure where you have for every host where you need to use public IP address, which is really not possible in reality. So it's always good that if you are having one single public IP address, you can still translate numerous hosts to the one single public IP address with the help of a port number. And that's what we are going to do today. We will be using translation to this public IP address on the interface of the ASA firewall itself, which is 192.168.29.2. So when you're trying to telnet from the router, which is outside, and you're trying to telnet using this public IP address via the port number 5050, that must let you to access R3. Okay, so similarly, if you are trying to use 192.168.29.2 via port number 2323, it must let you get access to R1. Okay, so let's look at the configuration. I think I have already configured the router 3 and router 1 with the IP address, but let's just check. Let's go to router 3. Show IP interface brief. You can see the IP address is configured, which is good. And for the router 1, I have the IP address configured. That's looking good. Let's go to router, which is outside the router here. So in outside, show IP interface brief. That looks to be configured. Okay. Now let's go with the ASA and see what configurations we already have. Okay, so show run. Okay. So this IP address is configured. That's looking good. And we have the outside interface gigabit 0/1. That's looking good. And okay, so we do not have any routing. I'm just going to make sure that there are no routes present here. Sure, on NAT, I already had clear config in NAT, clear config access list. Okay. So exit. Show run NAT. Okay, show run access list. Let me also clear some objects that I have got there. So show run object. Let me clear this one. Okay, show run object. That's all cleared. All right. Okay, so show I still got this default route, but let's do that again. So it's like a fresh ASA firewall. Okay, now let's see. So this firewall will just have IP address. Apart from that, everything is gone, but let's verify. Okay, okay, good. So show you can see the commands that the interface are up. Okay, very good. So we have just the IP address configured on this ASA firewall, but we do not have any routing in place. But let's go ahead and configure routing. So what I will do is let's configure telnet for all these 3 routers first. Okay, and then we'll configure the routing. So let's go with router 3. So configure, I'll rename this. So name, host name, I'll rename this to R3. Okay. So line B to Y, 0 to 4, So I'll say transport input all, password Cisco, enable password, I'll give enable password. I'll just say enable itself, okay? Yeah, so do right and just save this configuration. At the same time, I also want to make sure that there is routing in place. So I will go ahead and enable the routing. In this case, I'm going to use the static route. So let me go to router 3, and on the router 3, I would say default route. So IP route 0.0.0.0, again 0.0.0.0. This is the default route I'm configuring, and next hop IP address 10.1.1.2. Okay, so that's all with this configuration for the routing. And let's move to the ASA firewall. Okay, on the ASA firewall, I would need a default route towards my ISP, right? So configure terminal. Okay, IP route towards my internet. So 0.0.0.0.0.0.0 again. And then my default gateway is 192.168.29.1, which is just looking like the internet cloud on this diagram. Okay. And okay, so route outside. Let me just copy these details. Okay, that's it. And for me to get through the internet, I got this default route. And for the router is here. Let me just rename this host name router outside. I'll just say router out, okay? And we got this IP address already configured and it's showing up for the status. Let's configure the routing protocol. So IP route 0.0.0.0.0.0.0. This is the default route. Okay, and my outside interface is 192.168.29.2. 29.2. Okay, that's all for the default route on the router outside. Okay, so now let's check if there is telnet. So is there a telnet? I don't think so. Yeah, let's configure telnet. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, transport input is none. Let's configure telnet. So line VTY 024. Okay, transport input all, password Cisco. Okay, exit enable password, and enable password, I'll just keep the word enable itself. Okay, do right to save those configurations. Okay, so now we have configured the routing protocols for all the 3 routers. Okay, so let's try to see if you're able to get in touch with the, if you can ping these devices from the ASA firewall. Okay, so let's go to ASA firewall and let's try to ping the internet 8.8.8.8. So that's reachable, which is good. Okay, and let's configure the access list to permit the telnet from outside. So, and also we'll permit ICMP. So access list out to in permit TCP, and I'll say allow any host because we all just have one host to any. Okay, then I also say access list out to in permit ICMP any to any. Access list. Okay, we need to give access group. So configure terminal, access group. Okay, out to in interface for the outside. That's all with the access list configuration. Okay, so now let's check if you're able to telnet this routers from outside router. I'll just go to router out and let's try telnet 10.1.1.1. That's working. Okay, password was Cisco, enable password is enable, and that's getting us to reach R3. And if you are wanting to reach R1, okay, let me exit out. So telnet 10.1.1.3, that should get us to reach R1. Okay, so we're getting this error remote host not responding. Let's just check the configuration in R1 to make sure if routing is something that we missed. So show run. Okay, I guess we have not configured the default route. Let's configure the default route. Configure terminal IP route. Okay, 0.0.0.0. 0.0.0.0, and the IP address is 10.1.1.2. So 10.1.1.2. Now I guess it should work. Let's check. Let's go to our router outside and we'll telnet. I'll just copy this and paste it over. If you see telnet, it's transport input none. So we have not enabled telnet. So line VTY 024, transport input all, password Cisco, exit, enable password, enable. Okay, that's all. Now let's check. Yeah, so we had to configure telnet and also configure the routing, and that's the reason we couldn't get in touch with the router one from our outside router. So enable, that is letting us to this router one. Okay, so router one, let's rename this host name R1. Okay, just save this. Okay, now we have got the telnet, but our main task is that we do not want to access this R3 and R1 with a private IP address. We want to make sure that somebody who is working from home should have no idea about what our private IP address is. And we want them to have access to the router 3 and router 1 with the help of public IP address. But with only one single public IP address, they should be able to connect to router 3 also and router 1 also. So if they are connected via port number 5050, that should go to R3, and via 2323, that should go to R1. So this is what our goal of the lab is today. So let's go ahead and configure static auto pad. Okay, we are going to do a static pad and using the Auto NAT in the first place. So it's very simple. Auto NAT we have already done in the previous video also. Let's go to our ASA. We'll just create some objects first. So I will create an object for the router 3 that you see there at the top left hand side. Okay, so exit, let me configure, and then I say object network R3, yeah, and I say the host IP address that we have is 10.1.1.1, yeah, and this is the host IP address. We need to have a Auto NAT, so I would say NAT inside to outside, okay, static. And I am not going to purchase any public IP address. I will use the interface command just in case, even if the public IP address changes on this interface, it will automatically translate it to 192.168.29.2 or whatever, even if it changes. So I'm using interface command here, okay? And then service, we are going to use TCP, okay? And we are going to use telnet. That's what we are going to access from the outside router. And we are going to give a mapped port. So this is a map port through which we will be doing the port translation. Okay, so that's the port translation that we have done for our router 3. So anybody who is trying to access and telnet via 192.168.29.2 using the port number 50.50, that should get them connected to R3. Okay. So interface, let me just check here. Show run NAT. So 23.23. So let's just change this. We wanted 50.50, right? So 50 to 50. So this is the port for reaching our R3. So we're getting error. NAT configuration is not found for R3. Let's just manually type it. NAT inside, outside, okay, static interface, TCP, telnet, service, TCP, telnet, 50, 50. Okay, that's working. Now similarly, we have to create another object for our R1. And for R1, we want it to be translated via port 2323. Let's create object for the R1. Object network R1. Host. Host is this IP address 10.1.1.3. Okay. And we need to have Auto NAT. So NAT inside to outside, okay. Static interface, and we will use the service TCP because we want to telnet it. So I will say telnet, and the port that we're going to map it so that we can access this R1 is 2323. So 2323. That's all. It's very simple. So just save this, and you can verify using the command show NAT details. So you can see you can see Auto NAT policies. That's what we did. So from the inside, we are translating it via port 5050 to via the same single public IP address that we are using even for this 1.1 and for 1.3 host. The translated IP address is single public IP address. So just that the port numbers are changed. Okay. So via 2323 gets you to reach R1. Okay. And via 5050 gets us to telnet R3. So let's go ahead and verify it. We'll go to the router or router out. Okay. And instead of giving the proper IP address that we gave earlier, we will this time use public IP address. So one single public IP address. I'm not going to use multiple public IP address. You can just have a look. So telnet. So 192.168.29.2, because that's the interface IP address on this ASA outside. Okay. And don't forget to mention that port number that you are mapping it. So via 5050. So that should get us to R3. Let's check. Just exited out of that earlier R1. So we are back to router out. So we are on a router out here, and from this router, that is the user outside the private network trying to use internet service to get access to R3. So for me to reach R3, the telnet 192.168.29.2, which is the interface outer public IP address on the ASA firewall, and the port number 5050, that should get us to R3. Let's see. So yeah, that has got us to R3. So you can access R3 using one single public IP address and the port numbers. Okay. And similarly, we want to even connect to R1. So, but for me to connect R1, I can still use the same public IP address, but use a different port. So 2323 that we have used in our NAT commands. So I will say telnet 192.168.29.2, and I'll use 2323 for the port number. Okay, it's asking for the password. I say Cisco enable password ENABLE. There it is. So you can access R1. So what we learned is we used Auto NAT and we tried to access from outside the private network. With the help of ISP, we were able to get in touch with the R3 and R1 using telnet. We got access to those private hosts using one single public IP address. But yes, definitely you will have to use the port numbers. And that's the reason why this static pad is also called as a port translation. Okay, so this completes the Auto NAT over static pad. Let us also configure static pad using manual NAT. That is also very simple. Let me just delete those older configurations that is configured on this ASA firewall for our Auto NAT. So I'll go to ASA. I'll just clear those NAT. I'll also clear the objects. Let's check show running object, show running NAT. Okay, so we don't have objects and we don't have NAT configured. Now let's go ahead and configure the objects. And also, it is also very important to know that when you're doing manual NAT, you will be configuring it under the global configurations. So let's go ahead and configure object network R1. Let's take R3. That's what we see here in the first, right? Let's take R3. Okay. And for the auth3, the host IP address. So what's the host IP address? 10.1.1.1, right? Okay. And we have one more object network R1. And what's the host IP address? 10.1.1.3. Okay. We also need to have object service. Okay. And here I'll say real TCP 23 and service TCP source equivalent port 23. I'll just say telnet. Okay. This is one of the object I'm creating, and that is a object service. We also need to make sure we have two mapped objects here for the service. So let's configure object service mapped. For R3, we will map it to mapped 5050. Okay. And the port number service TCP source equivalent that we will be mapping it is what? 5050, right? And we have one more service we need to map. Okay. One more service that we are mapping, that is serve object. Let's give object service mapped 23. We say map 23, right? We give 50, so 23. And we say service TCP source equivalent 23. Okay, we have configured the objects for our host present. We also have configured the object service for each of our host to which we will be mapping it to the ports. Okay, so now we will go ahead and configure the static path using the manual NAT. Okay, very simple. Just exit out of this. Okay, and I will say NAT inside. Okay, to outside. We also need to make sure that you specify the source static. So the first host that we have here is what? R3, right? So I'll just take R3, and I want to NAT it to my public IP address, which is present on the interface itself on this ASA firewall. And I want to use this service. So what service I want to use? I want to use TCP. I want to use telnet. And the real telnet IP address, what is the object that I have given? The object I have given is real TCP 23, in which I have specified equivalent telnet, right? So I'll just take this real TCP 23 and I want to map it to mapped 5050, correct? So mapped 5050. So mapped 50 and 50. Okay. Now, similarly, for our R1, inside to outside, source, static, R1, and we want to get translated to public IP address present on the interface of the actual ASA port, okay, and service, and this is the real TCP in which we have the service for 23. Okay, so real TCP 23, and this is mapped 2323 port number. So 23 and 23. So that's going to get us to R1. Okay, let's just press the enter button. No errors. So just save this to write. Just write it. building configurations. That's all. Let's move to router outside. Okay, telnet. We will go via public IP address 192.168.29.2 and use port number 5050. Okay. Password Cisco. Enable password is enable, and you can see there is R3 connected. Let's see the hit counts. So show NAT details. So you have one hit count for untranslation and one for the translation hits. That's good. And that's for 50-50. And that has got us to 10.1.1.1. That's what we were on R3. Let's verify R1. Okay. So we are on the router outside. And on the router outside, so telnet 192.168.29.20. Okay, 29.2 and connected via 2323. Cisco enable. Enable is the password. Okay, so that has got us to R1. So let us also check the hit counts. So earlier we had 0 and 0 for the translation hits and for the untranslation hits. So let's say show NAT details. And there it is. You can see that there is increase in the hit counts now. Okay, so that's all about the configuration of static pad using Auto NAT and Manual NAT. I hope that this video has been informative to you all. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.